Together. Okay, it's speaking to me. All right, so let's go on, and then we're going to end with a Q&A. For when we use the word reading, what we talk about is we grant that there's aspects of reading such as decoding, fluency, and those sorts of issues. When we talk about reading, we are particularly interested in the processing of linguistic symbols in order to extract something that's meaningful, understandable, memorable, that relates to the person. So it's this idea of drawing inferences and comprehension that we deal with. We were going to define printed text and then in a moment digital text. Printed text is the kind of text you have when you open a book or you read on the newspaper. It seems to be a dying art among many of my current undergraduates, but it's the actual sort of experience of seeing the language on print. So in a book or in some other, even a sheet of paper would work for us. The contrast to that is digital reading. Now, in digital reading, you're still using linguistic symbols, but they are presented to you in the medium of a digital screen. It could be a computer, as we're using now here in front of me, but iPads or any sorts of tablets or even smartphones. I often see my undergraduates reading their assignments on a phone. I don't know how they do it, but they must have good eyes, I'm sure. And then, of course, is the issue of comprehension. As someone who spent over almost 15 years on NAEP reading, for example, comprehension is something that matters greatly to me. I'm a comprehension researcher, which means what I'm interested in is what it is that the individual understands from what they read and how they make that part of their thinking and their life experiences. And so those are one more term that we need to present to you is probably less familiar, and that's calibration. Calibration is something that we're concerned about because it's how one effectively or accurately judges how well they're performing, how well they're understanding, how well they've done in terms of getting an idea from a piece of text or from a lecture or from a discussion. So calibration is a judgment of accuracy that we have. Some people are well calibrated, which means they make judgments that are pretty accurate. They know when they get it, they know when they don't. Other individuals, particularly younger students or those who are less familiar in an area, are often poorly calibrated, which means that there's a great deal of distance between what it is they think they've done or understood and what they actually walk away with. So those are terms you're going to be seeing and hearing from us. So now I'm going to present and summarize very quickly because I don't assume you want to be bogged down in a lot of studies, but I want to explain before I introduce this how we even came to this topic, which we do, and that is this topic of print versus digital. And I owe it to the brilliance of Lauren and I guess a degree of serendipity. Lauren, explain, if you will, how you came to that.
Sure. So I did my undergraduate studies in special education and educational psychology at Penn State. So I am very excited to be talking to Pennsylvania educators today. And when I was in a general education kindergarten classroom in Altoona, the students were taught how to read just like all of us in this virtual room probably were. The teacher at the whiteboard or chalkboard, and then it was time to practice independently. However, when it was time for the students to go work on what we had just learned, instead of grabbing a book like at least I had done when I learned how to read, each student went and grabbed an iPad from the computer cart. And I said to the teacher, it looks like they're almost reading differently. I saw them clicking on words or moving in ways that didn't look natural or how you would in a print book. So I said, this is so interesting. I've never seen kids reading on iPads when they're learning. What does the research say? And she's like, I don't know, we want a grant. So I went to the principal and said, what does the research say about learning how to read and reading in print? And she said, I don't know, we want a grant. So I did some digging and it turned out there wasn't a lot of research on it. And the research that was there about reading digitally versus in print wasn't very clear. And that's what led me to finding Patricia and starting my PhD research on reading across mediums.
Yeah, it was a great experience. And in truth, when we first started these, we weren't really sure what we were going to find. If anything, we deal with college students, for example, who believe themselves to be tech nerds, you know, part of being digital natives. And so we thought, let's give it a shot. Let's see if there's anything that emerges. And this is the first study that came from that brainstorm that Lauren had that we ran. And in it, what we did now, again, for those of you who teach younger kids, we're dealing with college students. And the reason we started there was we wanted to see, well, we want to look at individuals who should be the most, who are mature readers, who don't come to us with a severe reading problems typically, and who therefore are been spending years on digital media. So if we find anything that might tell us something that it's worth looking at. And so we started with these undergraduates, and the question that we posed was whether or not there was any difference in what students understood and in their calibration, meaning their comprehension and calibration, when they read the same thing on paper versus on a computer screen. And they were 90 undergraduates that we studied, and each of them read two texts that were comparable texts in counterbalanced order. Now that's jargon, which means we didn't want everybody reading the same text in print and then reading a different text in digital, because then you don't know if it's the text or it's the medium that matters. So we counterbalance, which means the student A would read the ADHD piece, while the second student would read something on how you cope with students' chronic illnesses. And what we did with those two segments is, as we said, we had them read one segment on paper and one on digitally. And then we measured comprehension, again, which is our interest. And in that comprehension, we looked at three kinds of questions. The first one being what we might call the gist, the gestalt question, the big picture question. What did you get? What was this thing about? What was the author trying to tell you? And then we asked them to recall some very key points in this piece of text. The text, Lauren, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it was about a page and a half of printed text. So we're not talking about a massive document at this point. And at this point, it's no pictures. It's the piece of text as it appeared. And then the final question we asked them was to share additional details that were not as major, but still informative. And then what we did was we asked a simple question before and after. Beforehand, we said, do you prefer to read this kind of thing in print or on computer screen digitally? And we talked about kinds of print reading versus digital reading. And then after they read, and after they completed the comprehension questions, now they've just filled out the comprehension questions, we asked them to tell us how they did. So how did you do in the print version? How did you do in the digital version? So this is not a complex study. And in many ways, it was a fairly clean and simple study, but the findings were overwhelmingly shocking. And not this first one. Not surprisingly, the students preferred like 90% to read, our students, digitally. They didn't want a book. They didn't want to read newspapers. They wanted, show it to me on computer screen. And we said, okay, that makes sense. These are digital natives. And most students, after they completed the readings and answered the questions under the two forms, said, I did better when I read digitally. My digital comprehension was superior to my print. The irony was over 90% of them did better in the print version, not the digital version. And that's true for all kinds of questions except for the what was this thing about, this main idea question. And that one, there was no difference between the mediums. They did just as well in print or just as well digitally. So we were shocked at this thing. And as you can see, because of the difference in what they thought they did and how they actually did, they were really poorly calibrated, very, very poorly calibrated. And we, at this point in time, because it was the first study, which by the way, got picked up all over the world. When I have a student whose grandfather in the Netherlands sent us a newspaper clipping with this thing on the front page. This study somehow grabbed hold of people, and because they hadn't really thought about it. And like us, they didn't know what to expect. They didn't really assume that there would be any major difference. but there indeed were, but we had no clear rationale why. So that led us to the second study. Now, in the second study, which actually was occurring simultaneously, we did a very detailed, systematic review of the literature, that we wanted to find anything we could find that where the study included people reading both in print and digitally. So it had to have both of those conditions. And again, we wanted to see what kind of trends we could figure out. We were looking for those explanations, for those rationales that might exist. We found the 36 studies that we went and we processed. And this is, again, appeared and received a lot of interest among the general public as well as the literacy community. And here's what we found. We found that that literature is very messy. There was no clear one answer. It wasn't that print is better or that digital is consistently better. It really came to the issue of it depends in this literature that we looked at. And there were certain conditions that seemed to matter. First of all, I should point out that one of my pet peeves among my own colleagues is they don't tell you what they mean by things that they're studying. They don't define their terms. They don't tell you what it means when they mean digital reading. They don't tell you a lot of things. In some cases, I remember, Lauren, they didn't even tell us how long the texts were, what kind of texts they were. And that's really sad, because if you're trying to build a picture, it's hard to know. And we found three kind of trends in this literature that's worth talking about. We call the first one incremental. And incremental is probably a really crappy word for it, but that's my scientific word. It's that there's a really sharp increase in things. And what there's been a real sharp increase is in the number of studies that involve having students read digitally. Whether they read both is a question, but their digital reading is growing and growing and growing, and it's kind of pushing out in a lot of academic realms the print reading. And also that the variety of digital devices over time that we studied had drastically changed, has gone up. There's more and more devices that one could use to read digitally. Now, the stationary trends are those that look fairly flat. They're not changing very much. And that is that they kind of look at these things in the same sort of research settings that they typically do. And the choice of participants is fairly consistent numerically. But where there's wide fluctuation and where we thought we might have an answer was in this idea of, and that's what iterative means, that comes and goes, is length of the text and whether or not those texts were manipulated, whether the person doing this research particularly crafted them in a certain way, or were they using really existing text, what many of you would call authentic text or not. And we found in our thinking that perhaps there were the keys to what we wanted to know. Text length, it seemed as the text length went up, that print became more dominant. It also seems that if you're reading narrative, there's probably more of a likelihood of equal distribution of which does better. But if they manipulated the text, it probably had a benefit, I think, to digital because they manipulated it in a way that made the digital more useful or informative. So that led us to yet another question, which is, this is the way it goes for us, right? Okay, they got that now, but there's other things we need to know. Let's test this whole thing about length, for example. Let's put that to the test to see what we find. So we wanted to know, again, whether or not the students' comprehension and calibration changed. And did it change for different questions? But this time, we were very systematic about using longer pieces of text to start with. All right. Again, we did our great undergraduates. Thank God I teach these huge lecture classes, like 200 students at the time. We have plenty of subjects we can use. And we again use the texts that deal with childhood ailments. The students again read, and you're going to see that after a while, you should be able to repeat this in your head without seeing it. One segment they read on paper, and counterbalance, they read another of the two on computer screen. Now, we measured the comprehension as we did in the past. That is, we looked at the main idea, we looked at key points, and we looked at details. But this time, we also looked at how long it took them to read. Now, this is going to become important in what we find. Again, the students completed a self-report topic. How much do they know about the subjects of childhood ailments? So a lot of these people, they're not College of Ed students per se, but a lot of them have backgrounds that deal with special populations. And they also then rated their comprehension as they did in the first study after, or the study of 3, who knows? Anyway, all right, so here's what we found. We found that when you do direct comparisons between print and digital, that there was a clear advantage for print. This is the third time or second time that we keep seeing print. No, in our studies, it's the second time that print has come out clearly ahead. There's no if, and, or buts. There's no mixed outcomes. It's very clear that print serves these students' comprehension across all the questions, but main idea well. Now, we also found that processing time was a big factor. And this, again, leads to insights, right? It's not just that they're reading it digitally. We found that they read a heck of a lot faster when the text is presented on screen. Their eyes seem to, and there's a lot of now eye tracking studies that would help to confirm this. They tend to skim much more with their eyes when they're reading on computer than they do when they're reading in print. Another thing that's not mentioned here that'll come up later, I believe, is every time you scroll when you're reading a longer piece of text, you lose the sense of place that you have when you read in print. As you see in that young girl reading in that book, she can visualize where that picture is or where the text is on the page. But when you scroll, students often report losing a sense of where something is on the printed page. And again, surprise, no, it's not. They still think they do better in digital, but their performance is by far better in print. So there's something about the seduction of the digital screen that inflates their sense of how well they're doing. And it could be related to speed. It could be related to the fact that if you're reading quickly, you're going through quickly, you may interpret speed as meaning I'm better at something. All right, then we go to the next study. Now this one is unique because what we chose to do in this particular study is not just look at what we call variable centered. That is time. Does time matter? Does length matter? We wanted to look and see what kind of profiles of readers emerged when we do this kind of study. Then it's called a person-centered analysis. It gives us a chance to look at the characteristics of students who fall in certain sorts of clusters. So again, you've seen these before, these same kind of issues, but we add the question of reader profiles and what reader profiles emerge across these two mediums. Now I'll say here, because I don't want to forget to say it, we found that the same sort of profiles came out in both mediums, so that whether it's print or it's digital, these same profiles I will describe to you emerged under those conditions. Those students could move from one to another to some extent, and they did. 57 undergraduates. Now this time it's biology text, and it's much more, it's like an intro bio book. So it's got a lot more of the kind of graphics that you see in naturally occurring text and expository texts that students read at this level. And actually we try to use books that are at the introductory level for these courses, but they're not the ones that the students use. And again, they each read one on print, and you got that routine down, right? I don't even have to say this sort of thing. And we kept real-time processing data and behaviors as well. So what Lauren did and what our undergraduate assistants in the lab would do is, as the students are reading, they're coding and watching for behaviors that are also systems that Lauren had in place where she could track whether or not they go back or they stay on page, all those sorts of little surface level processing features that we could record, because we knew that those might make a difference in these profiles. We measured comprehension as we've done before, but here again, we're adding time as an important variable. And students completed their self-reported topic knowledge, and then they again rated their comprehension after. All right,
Can I
Now,
add
here's
one
what-
thing?
Yep, jump in, girl.
Thank you. So why we chose to look at their real-time processing behaviors was because in the previous study, we saw students were reading more quickly in print. So the question in digital. So the question became, why are they reading more quickly? What are they doing with the printed text that they are not doing when engaging with the digital text?
That's
And
great. That's good.
the way to answer that was to track their movements as they engage with the text.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Lauren, while you're out there, tell what kind of behaviors did you track? Can you name some of those?
Yes, so we did this by piloting data, having students come in and just read texts for us in print and digitally and tracking them. We did that for reading in print. We would put on a GoPro that most people
Yeah, that's right.
way more exciting things than reading. Students who came into the lab were always so excited to put in the GoPro, and I was like, and now you're going to read with it. And they were like, oh. But what we did was we laminated the textbook and we asked them to follow along with a thin whiteboard marker, the same way you would follow along with your finger as an early reader. We said, when you go reread a text, go and underline it again. If you skip any, just don't follow with your pen, etc. And then when reading digitally, we had software on the computer that monitored everything on the screen. And we asked students to follow along with their mouse cursor as they read. All students completed little trial sessions of this beforehand. So by the time they got to the study, they were experts at following along with the marker or the cursor. And the type of behaviors we saw, the main one, of course, is reading. The next would be rereading a text. That's when they go back and read a part of the text they've already read. They often would refer to the picture. Again, these are biology textbooks, so sometimes it would say, as seen in figure 4.2. And if the student goes to figure 4.2 when the text told them to, we coded that as refers to picture when directed. Sometimes other students, though, would read the text just as it appeared in the book and then get to the picture whenever it was placed in the text. So that would be a different code, which is refers to picture when it appears.
Right.
Students would often skip sections, which was coded as skipping. Often students looked ahead. So as soon as they were given the text, they would go immediately to the end to be like, wow, how long is this going to be?
That's my strategy. No.
Yeah. How much do I have to do? So those are some of the behaviors we coded. And those were coded, of course, after they completed the session. Every 3 seconds, we coded what the student was doing.
Yeah. Thanks, Lauren. Okay. So what did we find? 4 profiles emerged. Now remember, these profiles are constructed by the kinds of data Lauren just described in reading time as well. And they're also verified by whether or not there were comprehension differences between these profiles, so that there's some degree that these profiles matter, okay? And I'm going to explain each one in turn. So there was what we called the regulators, the plotters, the gliders, and the samplers. Okay, so what do those mean? The regulators were those individuals who seemed to be very aware and conscious of what they were doing. They would be the kind to go back, and if they got to a point, they would jump back and reread a segment to make sure they understood it, to clarify things for themselves, or to link, as Lauren was saying. What they would do is this group would be, oh, there's a picture. Let me go back and see what that said about that. And the other thing about them is that this group read long, they took longer to read than the others. These are not timed exercises, so they could take as long as they chose to do. So those were the regulators. The second group was the plotters. Some of the reviewers did not necessarily like our names, but so be it. The plotters were those that read what Lauren was describing, very linearly, right? They would go through line by line. And they also were very slow readers. Now, remember, these are undergraduates, but those of us who have taught elementary school, we know exactly what these plotters look like. It's like it's very slow, which always in elementary school with the fluency issue can affect what you remember or can recall. The third group was the gliders. The gliders are interesting because they're also linear readers. It doesn't seem like they're skipping, jumping. They're reading quite linearly, or as Lauren was saying, they'd come to the picture when the picture, but they're fast. They seem to be very fluent and quick readers. as they went through, much faster than all the other groups, over a minute faster than all the others. And then the final one, which is an interesting group. I don't necessarily have rich explanations for them, but they're individuals who would seem to read linearly at some points, but then they would look for something that they thought was going to be important. I don't know. I think I have an idea about these groups, and I'll share what my speculation is. But then when they got to certain sections, they would be much more deliberate and much more attentive. And to me, these are the individuals who are trying to look for what we're likely to ask questions about. You know how the students are taught sometimes as study strategies to look at the questions first, and then you go read the passage. And a lot of the students in NAEP would do just that sort of thing. They would scan the questions and then scan the text to find where that part of the segment is. But keep that in mind. I guess if you're a sampler, if you're really good at predicting, you're in good shape. But perhaps this group was not so good at prediction. So what did we find? Again, we found print and calibration profiles were very similar, as I mentioned to you. And again, the same sort of pattern we've had before. Overall print is going to be better, right? That's what we find each time in these studies so far. We're waiting to be surprised, but not yet. Now the regulators, and you can see by their profiles, this makes sense, were by far those that performed the best on comprehension measure. They really were better than gliders, who came in second. It sounds like a race, but the gliders came in second, and then the plotters. But then those poor samplers had the lowest overall comprehension scores. And again, I think that's because they were just trying to guess what somebody's going to ask them. They were just picking up pieces and not doing it by being directed by what they knew would be areas of importance. The overall medium effect, again, favored print, as I said, but there was no calibration differences by medium. In other words, they were equally poorly calibrated, whether they were reading on print or digitally. I hope those of you who are listening in are getting the idea that maybe these kids need to learn how to calibrate better. All right, now, the last study I'm going to talk about was just accepted, and it's just going to be coming out it says revision under review. That's not true. It actually has been accepted. So congratulations, Lauren. It's coming out, and I'm very pleased about this one. And so this one, you're going to get pre-public access. Now here, what we wanted to do is take this one step further. Yeah, I guess that's right, grammatically. And here we wanted to know whether or not, and Lauren said to you, the pictures were an interesting little tidbit in some of these students' behaviors. Some of them paid absolutely no attention to the pictures or the text, the illustrations, what graphs, whatever were there, whereas others would sample them as the text indicated and that sort of thing. So what we wanted to do is we call this multimodal and multimedia, because the media is print versus digital. The multimodal is the kind of graphics, visuals, pictures that are in the text as well. And so you're getting a more complex notion about what authentic texts look like for anything in high school to undergraduates and so forth. And so we also did something different here because of the introduction of these visuals. We asked questions that could be answered either by the text or by the visuals. Those that could be answered only in the textual content, that is the stuff that was written out linguistically. And then some that were visual only, that the answer could be found only if you processed the visual materials. We weren't sure what we would find, but we figured that maybe the visuals were not going to be the dominant one, but we'll see. 54 undergraduates, and this time we went geology, different kinds of graphics and illustration on weather and soil. By the way, the students felt they knew more about weather than they know about soil, which was probably fair. They didn't know a heck of a lot about soil. They read one on paper, we got all this, and while reading, we again captured real time. We measured comprehension then, as I said, by these different kinds of questions. Two of them could be answered by either the visual or the linguistic, the printed the print language, or they had to look only in the visual or only in the text. All right. And then they completed both a self-report guess of how much they knew about these topics, but then they also took a topic knowledge measure, so we could compare calibration there as well as calibration at the end. Students rated how well they did on the test, just like we've seen before. Now, here we go. You can probably, let's see, making predictions, right? Reading multimodal text in print, that was better. Even in the digital medium with all those visuals, it's better to read it, probably in part because in some cases the pictures were, you had to kind of scroll to get to the picture that was referred to. They weren't even side by side or next to each other. And so that could have complicated it for them. But again, the print wins out. Comprehension differences were more pronounced for the visual only questions. So this tells us that there's some students who are sensitive to the fact that the visuals in these in expository text are meant to be helpful and informative, and add to what is presented in terms of written language. The student self-reported topic familiarity compared to their demonstrated was pretty sad. We again find that they don't really know what they know. That's a kind of what we would call metacognition. They're not really aware of how much they know about something. Then they underestimate. If you're bright, you tend to underestimate. If you're, in the other categories, you may overestimate a performance. And predicted comprehension performance compared to actual performance, as we said, shows us that these students are poorly calibrated, both in terms of guessing up front what they know about something, but then their comprehension performance at the end. Okay. And now I'm going to stop sharing and Lauren's going to pick it up.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. And I am going to pick up right on, finally, our intervention on digital reading. So at this point, we are confident and comfortable with the understanding that participants are doing better when they read in print, and that they're not the best calibrators. They're not good judges of their performance. So what this led us to was a two-part study, which looked at the role of multimodal text. So again, print and visuals on comprehension and calibration. We also wanted to improve on a few things. One of those is the measure. So how we were measuring even topic knowledge became better. Our study design itself became better. And we used more sophisticated statistical analyses to be sure that the conclusions we were drawing were statistically sound. Then what we changed and what we added here, this is the big exciting thing, is we introduced an intervention on digital reading behaviors and reading speed. Because once again, at this point, we're confident that reading digitally is making people read more quickly, be less well calibrated, and overall understand less. So the question is, can we intervene in this? Can we make it better? So this took place in a two-part study. The first study's questions probably look pretty familiar to you. Again, we wanted to know about reading times and real-time processing behaviors, and if that changes comprehension, performance, and calibration. Next, we wanted to look at profiles. So again, instead of going variable-centered, can we go person-centered and see if any profiles emerge, which use, again, processing behaviors, reading time, and calibration skills. And then once we formed those groups, we wanted to know if there were going to be significant comprehension differences for the resulting groups. Now, study 2, in my opinion, is where things really get interesting. This is where we introduce the intervention. So we wanted to know first, what are the effects of introducing just a quick intervention that targets self-regulation of digital reading time and depth of processing on comprehension and calibration accuracy. Then once we put the students through this intervention, we were curious to see if we had them read a text digitally again and answer the same comprehension questions, what verifiable groups would emerge based on that processing data reading time and calibration, and their accuracy skills after that intervention. Lastly, of course, we wanted to know, does the intervention work? So we answered this by comparing comprehension scores and calibration scores for the pre-intervention to post-intervention groups. So our methods, once again, our participants, we had about 70 undergraduates. Overall, the demographics were pretty representative of the population we were pulling from. And again, they read from a geology textbook on our favorite topic, soil and weather.
Speak for yourself, Lauren.
I don't know about you, I love reading about soil and weather for fun. Again, these texts were pretty similar in length, about 3 pages, and had a grade 14 Fry readability score. There were 4 visuals in each text. And again, we counterbalance this. So some students read soil text digitally first, some read weather text digitally first. It turns into 4 conditions when you set it up that way. So just so you have an idea of what types of visuals we're talking about here, these are a few examples of the visuals that were found in these textbook passages. They were not altered. Again, some are graphs that give you some information. Some are pictures that talk about a topic that may have been introduced in the text, etc. So for the first study, we again started with a demographic questionnaire, then a topic knowledge measure, and this one was a much deeper and richer measure of their comprehension. Next, we had a comprehension measure, which again, you all could probably describe back to us at this point. And then again, we asked for their judgments of the performance. So from 0 to 100, how well did you do on the print comprehension measure? And the same question after reading digitally. From there, we created calibration accuracy scores based on their actual comprehension and their perceived comprehension. We coded their behavior every 3 seconds for the processing behavior codes. We looked at reading duration, etc. And this is what that looked like for the student. They came to our lab and completed an IRB to make sure they consented to being in the study. They completed the topic knowledge measures. Then they had their first reading prompt, read the first passage, did the first comprehension measure, then read passage 2, second comprehension measure, and did their judgments of performance. Participants are always allowed to stop and take breaks whenever they need. Now let's look at the methods for study 2. So again, study 2 is where we introduce the intervention. Participants from study 1 were invited back to the lab 2 weeks later. We had 65 of the 70 return. So the demographics are almost identical to study 1. And again, this is the digital reading intervention. So this is the first to our knowledge of its kind. And we thought, what if we just do a simple intervention? We built it on PowerPoint that goes through 5 modules. It takes about 30 minutes that teaches the students about the research on reading digitally. So we went through 5 modules with them. The first was about reading preferences. The next was about print and digital comprehension performance. The third module looked at reading speed. The fourth looked at judgment and performance and calibration. And the fifth and final module looked at strategies and profiling readers.
And Lauren, can I say part of it is that when you created these is we felt that the students were just not picking up on the fact that they didn't know this or that they were reading faster. It's a matter of just making them aware in part, wasn't it?
Exactly. So we figured at this point, the students don't know what they don't know. Anecdotally, what was so interesting was all the data we collect is, of course, on paper, but as students would go to leave the lab, they would just want to tell me about why they did better digitally and start listing the reasons. And the second they left, I'd look at their answers and see they were wrong. So we realized they have no clue how quickly they're reading, how poorly they're comprehending, and also that their behaviors are changing as soon as we put that text online. Mm-hmm. So our goal of this intervention was, what if we just tell them, hey, when you read online, you're reading way more quickly. You're not rereading important parts of the text, etc. Would that have a difference? In this intervention, we ended each module with a couple of comprehension check questions. And if the participant got it right, they would be told that. And if they got it wrong, it was retaught quickly. Okay, so the measures, variables, and procedure are exactly the same in study 2 as they were in study 1, but only for the digital condition. We did not make these poor students reread and print as well. And here's what we found. Once again, you could fill in the blanks here. Students read longer when they had reading in print. They once again used those deeper processing behaviors like rereading text, referring to the visual when it's referenced in the text, reading the caption of the visual, etc., and did better on comprehension overall. Now, the information source here did not matter. So if the question was about something in the visual, the text, or both, they still performed better when they read in print. And we found that 3 clusters emerged for these print and digital reading groups, which we'll talk about a bit more on the next slide. But overall, they were 1, highly capable and well-calibrated readers. The second cluster was capable readers, but they didn't have that multimedia savvy. And the third group was lower performing and poorly calibrated. So unfortunately, struggling in both areas. Now, we found that some students' cluster memberships changed when they read in a different medium. So for example, someone who may have been in cluster 1, that highly capable and well-calibrated group for print, became less multimedia savvy as soon as they moved to digital. So again, I want you to take a moment and look at this. The number outside the parentheses is the number of people in that cluster group that moved. And then here is the percentage. So the distribution across here in print, you can see most of the students were lower performing and poorly calibrated to begin with. Once they moved to digital, that cluster grew even more. 50 of the total participants moved to that group. What's interesting, I also want to point out, is cluster 2. This group is less multimedia savvy. They barely engaged with the visuals at all. So most of them did not even refer to the visuals within the text. If they did refer to the visuals in the text, it was not when they were told to do so by the text itself. So now we have study 2 again. This is the intervention. So the questions are, can an intervention that teaches the students about the differences in reading in print and digitally help? And will it change anything? And also, what will happen to these profiles? So we found that after the intervention, comprehension significantly improved for reading digitally, which is wonderful. However, we weren't expecting this. Calibration scores worsened. So by telling the students that where they're struggling and what they're not great at, led to them actually predicting their scores to be even further from what they truly were.
But lower this time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so lower even. Post-intervention, we found 3 clusters, and these are different clusters with different identities that I'll go through. The first cluster was poor comprehenders, but well-calibrated. The next were high comprehenders, but poorly calibrated.
I like that first one, Lauren, I should say, because they're bad and they know they're bad.
Yeah. The first one knows themselves. They may not be the best comprehenders, but they know it. And I give them credit for that.
That's right.
Now, unfortunately, the third group, they were good comprehenders, not the best, but good. They were multimedia savvy, so they were able to navigate the print and the visuals well. However, they were not good judges of their performance again. And now we're going to look at shifts in cluster membership due to the intervention. So again, clusters behave differently after the intervention based on their identities. So pre-intervention, remember, these are the clusters I already introduced. Then on the right, we have post-intervention. And you can see the movement here. It's a bit more evenly distributed, but most members now belong to the good comprehenders, but not multimedia savvy and poorly calibrated group. Again, we found that their calibration dropped from that intervention, but overall comprehension went up. We saw, and then almost an even split between clusters 1 and 2. Okay. Now, Patricia and I are going to talk about the implications. Patricia, do you want to start?
Well, you can go ahead and do that one, and then I'll do the next one.
Okay. So these are some implications that we think are important for educators, parents, and readers yourselves, because all of us often have to pick between print and digital. We think you should consider from our research. The first is that today's readers are not as digitally savvy as assumed. So students in our classrooms were supposed to be digital natives who knew how to use these devices and grew up on them. But that may not be so true. We can't just assume it. We can't assume they're taking these reading skills that we were teaching in print and are able to capture them when reading digitally. Next, it's important to remember that the length of text and the amount of scrolling complicate digital reading. So it seems the longer the text, the more scrolling you need, the more so you may want to lean on that print medium. We found that students read faster on screen than with print. Again, that finding was consistent across all of our studies. And students showed a strong preference for reading on screen. And this finding was true no matter what type of reading we talked about. So for pleasure, for studying, reading the news, what have you. Next is that the accessibility and availability of digital text are significant factors in their use. So when we would ask students, why do you prefer digital? A lot of the reasons they would talk about were because of how easy it is. And again, I'm sure all of us can relate to that too. It's so nice to be able to grab a book or look up something on our phone. But it becomes concerning when we're reading these texts for deep comprehension, like Patricia said earlier, on our phone screens, because we know comprehension is changing. But again, there are clear and consistent advantages for print that warrant consideration despite how accessible and available those digital texts are.
Yeah, and I think thinking back to that teacher that in that Altoona school, that's the kind of person that should be at least attuned to that fact.
Absolutely.
You can go ahead, Lauren.
Okay. Another thing we found was that students routinely rated their performance better for the digital medium. So students left feeling more confident when they read in digital, no matter what other conditions changed. And that's something we were not expecting. Next is that comprehension performance was consistently better in the print medium. We tried different text types, different text lengths. Again, order, we changed up everything, but no matter what, comprehension was better in the print medium. Again, at this point, no surprise, and I'm sure a lot of you who are in the classroom every day are like, I know. Students are poorly calibrated. They do not know what they don't know. This type of question matters when reading this digitally. So again, when it's just asking for the gist or the main idea, medium isn't as important. Which makes sense. If I asked you to read a news article, you could tell me what the headline was from either medium. However, when it comes to specifics, that's really when print reading shines. That's when people are able to recall more, make more connections, even remember silly details or key or little facts or dates, etc. Print is superior. We're finding that students aren't instinctively translating those deep processing behaviors to the digital medium. So it's not that reading digitally changes the text itself, but it's changing the reader. We're not picking up those same self-regulation skills in some way or form as we move to that digital medium. And now we're seeing that the visuals in the text are not given much attention, which is really concerning, especially when you think about textbooks that your students are probably using every day. And I at least assume that students were engaging with those visuals as they read. But what's wonderful, and again, not all doom and gloom in this talk, is that we found digital reading can be improved. A simple 30-minute intervention allowed comprehension and overall speed to get better. We can make a difference in our students' reading.
Okay, so now let's kind of turn this around, and Lauren and I are going to kind of share this last point. This is the keys to improving digital reading performance in part, and their guidelines as well that we'll follow. So Lauren, I'll let you just click it through, and we go. All right, I think as a teacher, I think one of the first things I would say is you have to think about the purpose for reading, and depending on why you're reading something, is it just to get to kind of read it for enjoyment? And if so, then does it really matter? No. But like I'm working with medical doctors right now. I'm working with interns, and we're trying to figure out when they should take notes, take something off the digital page, because they too are very much guided by this kind of speed of reading and processing. And for them to improve, they need to really be aware of the fact that they need at times to take things off of the screen and put it onto paper in some fashion. You can just pull them all up and I'll go. The other one that Lauren has already said to you is, for goodness sake, slow down. If there's anything, it's just, and this is what her beautiful brief chain intervention showed us. And periodically stop and check your understanding. Can I remember what I just read? What was key here? What were some of the things? Students don't stop. They kind of go. And this idea of breaking it up is what people who are highly metacognitive do, or self-regulatory. And link the visuals information to the textual content. And Lauren told you about those people who did that, but not everybody did it. Not a good number of them did it. They either ignore the pictures or just kind of pass their eye over them when they get to them. And then I think for teachers, it's this idea of they need guidance in multimedia literacy. They don't know what a graph is versus what some of these more diagrammatic issues or procedural diagrams are versus a table or content. And they don't know how to process those differently. Or they, as we said, they don't know how to link. And those are some simple, I think, digital improvement steps that any teacher can take at almost any grade level. Okay. Well, thank you. I hope this was helpful to you. We're even really faster. One of the things I said to you I would do before we throw up the question and answer, I said to you I might throw in a point or two that if I were a parent, I would want to know. And I do think as parents, we watch them now give the digital devices to their children quite early. And Lauren and I have had a lot of concerns about when is an optimal age to be, giving the child access to these digital media without some guidance, without some sort of help in understanding how they engage in it. And I remember, as a person who has been teaching reading now for 50 some years, I will tell you that I remember what it was like to sit down with a young child with a book in hand, and the kind of intimacy that was experienced with the print. There's still some of that with the digital, but it's a very different sort of experience. The other thing is, Lauren, I was thinking as you were presenting, one of the things I would think about is students are so used to using digital devices for entertainment, for kind of escapism. And I think that may carry over into the academic setting because they don't think about the computer as this in the same sort of way as when that fat old textbook you had for whatever course it was. So I think that when you are used to treating digital media for entertainment purposes can have an overlay effect in what happens. So, and I would also say if parents ever, I know most of you in the audience are probably parents as I am, but my kid's 49 years old. He can figure this out for himself. But I would think setting parameters for when to be on screen for kids is very, very important. We know the disruptions on sleep patterns. We know so many more things about the effect of the digital screen even on the way the mind functions. So I hope parents are thoughtful about when and under what conditions they use the digital medium with their children.